It's your girl, Nikki Nellis, and today I am not at one of my industry night residencies. No City Ridge, no restaurant, no bar. I'm actually at home, surrounded by my plants and my dogs, and believe it or not, a ridiculous amount of whiskey. I went to my own bar. I pulled a little selection for today because I am very honored to be joined by someone who probably knows more about whiskey than almost everyone. You know him, Noah Rothbaum. Noah is the spirits editor at Men's Journal and one of the world's leading authorities on cocktails and spirits. He is a James Beard Award winner and a fellow at the James B. Beam Institute for Kentucky Spirits at the University of Kentucky. He's also a colonel, and we're going to get into that a little later because I had to look that one up. He's written The Art of American Whiskey. He's written The Business of Spirits. And he was the associate editor of the award-winning Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails. The man knows a lot. And with that, he now has this brand new doorstop of a book, The Whiskey Bible. It is a complete guide to the world's greatest spirit, according to Noah. It is more than 600 pages. It has history, it has secrets, it's got producers, lore, timeline, and 60 cocktail recipes. I mean, I feel like we cover everything. So, pour yourself a little something, something, and let's talk about how you take all this knowledge and tasting and turn it into a Bible. So, hi, Noah. Welcome to Industry Night.
Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, it's great to have you. I mean, you have great things behind you, but I feel like you should have some whiskey behind you as well. You know what I mean? We need to rearrange your room.
Whiskey has basically taken over my whole home. So this is like one of the few corners that is not stuffed with whiskey.
Your little sanctuary, your home away from
exactly.
home. So Noah, before we get into the book, because there's so much to discuss there, I'd really like to talk about, it's not like every 5-year-old boy is like, I can't wait to grow up one day and, be a whiskey drinker.
Right.
So can we talk a little bit about your getting into journalism and then becoming this expert on spirits and especially whiskey?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lot of folks assume that I come from a family of whiskey aficionados and collectors, and I feel bad debunking that myth. My folks, are not huge whiskey drinkers. There's probably the bottles that were in their liquor cabinet when I was a child are mostly still there, plus a lot of other stuff that I've given them over the years. People also think that I am have the appetite of somebody like Winston Churchill or Hemingway or, God help us, Bukowski, these legendary whiskey fans. And I don't, which is probably for the best. And most of the day I'm drinking coffee or water or other beverages. But, I really fell in love with whiskey when I was in college. I had done a semester in Scotland at St. Andrews before the Royals got there. So most Americans still were not that familiar with St. Andrews. Obviously, once the Royals were there, everybody in the whole world seemed to know about the school.
I will tell you, my son and his wife got married outside of the school area at a house there. It was fascinating.
I mean, it's a beautiful place. I mean, it's about... I don't know, not even an hour outside of Edinburgh. It's home to golf. When I was there were 8 courses, including the old course, which is obviously the golf course. But for me, it's like 3 streets, and at the time there were 35 pubs. So that gives you a certain idea of the hobby and the culture of the school and the town. So, I spent certainly a lot of time in pubs and sort of wondering about whiskey. And then I came home and I did an internship at Food and Wine. At the time, they had just hired a new associate editor named Pete Wells. Pete obviously would go on to become the New York Times restaurant critic for many years and their food editor for some time. And I also worked under Letty Teague, who now writes the wine column for the Wall Street Journal, and Kate Crater at Bloomberg. So, I mean, it's one of these things where I thought I knew about food and drinks. Obviously, I knew nothing, because I was still a kid. I was still a student. But really, after that summer, learning about, whiskey and cocktails, I really fell in love with, both obviously drinking them, but also the stories behind it and the history. And at the time, in the late 90s, early 2000s, nobody was really writing about drinks, right? It was very hard to get.
No, yours. It's funny as I was reading, sort of about you and diving into the book and everything. What I think is really interesting is that you were at sort of that moment when
Yeah,
things were really changing in this country when it came to cocktails and spirits. I mean, I look at my bar now and the amount of not just whiskey or bourbon or rye, but gin and I mean, and vodka that is being produced in this country. The amount of distilleries that have happened in the last 30 years has really been
it's
gobsmacking.
yeah. I mean, I think roughly there were six big distilleries in Kentucky about
Hmm.
25 years ago, and then a handful of other people who made a little bit of, mostly fruit brandies, sometimes, a
Right.
gin here or there, occasionally a whiskey, but now there are like over 2,000 distilleries across the country. So, I mean, it is funny. I mean, at the time, every few years, I thought, wow, like we've reached the mountaintop. Like it
Hmm.
cannot get better than this, right? Like we've
Right.
got 5 cocktail bars in New York City, like craft cocktail bars. Like this is it. We've made it. And, obviously we were far from the top of the mountain. But,
It's no, we are in exciting times, and I think, you know, where you were at that moment, it was very right,
oh, for sure. I mean,
what a time to be there, right place, right time.
absolutely. I mean, I feel very fortunate.
Hmm.
Early on in my internship, Pete was like, "Oh, let's go see my friend Dale," and I was like, "Okay." And it turned out to be,
Telegraph.
yeah, Dale DeGroff, who's the
Right.
father of the rebirth of the cocktail, and he'd just left the Rainbow Room and was working at a different bar in Midtown Manhattan. And I got to meet Dale, and it was incredible. Like, I thought I knew what cocktails tasted like, and then Dale made me some, and my mind was blown. Like, he found out that I was from the Bronx and was like, "Have you ever had a Bronx cocktail?" I was like, "There's a Bronx
No.
cocktail?" Right? Like, who ever heard of a Bronx cocktail? So he just whipped one up and was like, "Here you go." And I was like, "This is incredible." But it was weird because, it was almost like I had seen like a Yeti or something, right? Because I was like,
Right.
look, like, cocktails and spirits are amazing, like, classic cocktails and all this stuff. And everybody was like, eh, like, like nobody
Well,
cared.
I know, but you know what I think is really interesting is there's so much history,
Yeah.
not just to the whiskeys, because you really go deep here, obviously 600 pages, but to cocktails and to our history as Americans of what the different spirits mean to us and the history about them before Prohibition. I mean, you have the whiskey trail, right? The whiskey revolution and the taxes. There's so much there, and you get into so much of it. But let's come up a little bit. And once you've been writing for years. When you did, but when was the opportunity given to you to focus on whiskey in your early days, or were you
Well,
like, this is where I kind of want to be?
yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think, you know, I came out of school, and for about 6 years I worked at the Wall Street Journal's magazine, Smart Money, not how to make money, but how to spend it.
Mm, I'm good
Most,
at that.
yeah, me, I mean, I thought I was good
I'm
at it
really good at
too.
it. Hmm. I should make money. I should make money for how good I am at
Right,
spending money. I'm
exactly.
just saying.
It was a lot of fun telling people how to spend their money, and especially like for
Mm,
about 3 years, I was the travel writer on staff, and at the time, trying to figure out like how I could like write about drinks. Like how could I, and I'm convinced that some of these holidays, like Cinco de Mayo or even the Kentucky Derby, have become very popular and famous because folks like myself were looking for an excuse to write about booze.
mm.
And we did. And so for a number of years, it wasn't that clear. It was, I would try to write whenever I could about the topic, and ultimately was able to get agent and a book publisher interested. I guess in around 05, 06, I guess around 06 for my first book, The Business of Spirits, which was about trends in the liquor industry, which was a complete miracle that was published at the time because it was so far ahead of the curve. But that really allowed me to essentially focus on drinks at that point. But yeah, I don't know. It's one of those moments in your life when you're just sort of like, while it's happening, you sort of have an idea that your life is going to change forever, but you don't really realize it, until you're 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And I mean, if you had told me 25 years ago that I would still be writing about drinks, or I'd have the fortune to do what I've done, I don't think I would have believed you. I was just happy. Like, you mentioned rye whiskey. I mean, rye, like you couldn't get rye, in most places in America. Like the few people who made rye were making it one day a year, and they hated it because it's a lot harder to make than bourbon. And all the folks would call in sick on rye day. And, there were a lot of, if you ordered rye in a bar, even in Manhattan, they would say, they'd reach for Canadian Club, and they would say, oh, here you go. And you're like, yeah, like Canadian whiskey sometimes includes rye, but it's not straight American rye, which, you were talking about the founding of the country. That was our first whiskey. We are a nation, of course, of rum drinkers, and then rye, and ultimately bourbon, which has sort of stolen the title of America's native spirit. And if you can believe it, Congress got that wrong. They all
sort of, but they all sort of come at it in different ways. Not rum, obviously, because, we know exactly how rum got here. But, let's sort of, I feel like I'm going to jump ahead because of what you just talked about. You divvy the book up into sections and you compare the different whiskey, like basically American whiskey, Japanese whiskey, Scottish whiskey, Canadian whiskey. Can we kind of go through that a little bit?
Sure.
Because I think it is confusing for people. Not
Absolutely.
everybody's a whiskey aficionado, and there is a real educated palate out there now. Like, I think there's so many people who really enjoy the spirit. So could we take them apart a little bit? That'd be great.
Absolutely.
Okay,
like,
good.
I think you're right, because every time I do a talk, people, invariably somebody says, this is a really stupid question. And I say, there are no stupid questions when it comes to cocktails and spirits. And they say, what's the difference between bourbon and whiskey, right? So I think that confuses a lot of people. So whiskey is the overall category, right? So like...
Whiskey with an E, not without an E.
Right. I mean, that to be honest, that's sort of made up. But yes, like like in our modern idea, that is 100% correct. The general whiskey category is EY. Which is like, think of it as like soda, right? And then you have different types of soda: cola, ginger ale, root beer, lemon, lime, whatever Sprite and all those things are. So you have, the broad category is whiskey, which, one of the few things that everybody around the world can agree upon is that you have to make whiskey from grain, water, and yeast, right? And then it's aged in a barrel. India is the exception, where they sometimes still use sugar cane, like they mix that into their base, but that's changing. And we used to do that in Scotland or America, but like basically in the modern era, it's grain-based, water, and yeast. So all whiskey, no matter where it comes. Do Scotch because that's the easiest one. Scotch has to come from Scotland, right? I mean, it's in the name.
Easy.
It's in the name. You have basically two primary types of whiskey that's made in Scotland. You have single malt, which just basically means it's made from one distillery, all made from malted barley, which is just essentially the barley is treated so the starch is turned to sugar, because it's easier to make alcohol from sugar than starch. And it has to be made, aged, and bottled in Scotland, right? So those are things like Glenlivet, Glenfiddich, Macallan, all one distillery, all made.
Wait, what do I have? What do I have in front of me? I have. Oh no, I don't have Scotch. I I had Tullamore Dew,
Oh
an
yeah,
Irish
that's Irish
whiskey.
whiskey.
There you go.
So then
Yeah.
the other type of whiskey in Scotland is called blends. So basically, somebody's taken whiskey from these different distilleries, put
Mm-hmm.
them together, and then added what's called grain whiskey, which is whiskey made from grain but produced in a column still. Single malt is produced in a copper pot still, that kind of onion shaped still.
Mm-hmm.
It makes very, very rich, flavorful whiskey. It's just very, very slow, right? So a column still
Mm.
is incredibly quick, right? It essentially, it takes minutes instead of hours to make whiskey. Distillation is a separation process. I was the world's worst chemistry student, so if I can understand this, anybody can understand this. So
Okay.
basically, a column still, which
I'm ready to fight you for that title,
oh my,
Noah, but go ahead.
the column still comes around, is patented in 1830, like the most successful one. It really is adopted towards the end of the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, they take this, very, very smooth, quaffable whiskey called grain whiskey. They put it together with blends. That's what we get: Johnny Walker, Chivas Regal, Dewar's, J&B. That is basically the type of whiskey that everybody drank up until about 30, 40 years ago, and that's what made Scotch blends. Only really since like the 80s, 90s have people really started, like the lion's share of attention has focused on single malts, right?
Right. But
Ireland,
was that a financial thing?
well, I mean,
Because it seems like a single
yeah,
malt is a lot more expensive to make.
absolutely. So, I mean, essentially what happens around the world in the 70s and 80s is that the whiskey market crashes, right? Suddenly everybody's like, I don't want whiskey anymore. What my parents drank, no thank you. You have a cleaving of the generations over, giant issues like the Vietnam
Mm-hmm.
War or, and the two generations just do not agree, right?
Mm.
The folks going to Woodstock don't want to be drinking Tom Collins's at the country club and, blended scotch on the rocks and old fashions, right?
Right.
So that generation gravitates to things like vodka, which is new and sexy from Scandinavia. Andy
Mm-hmm.
Warhol and Basquiat are drinking, Absolute at Studio 54. Bianca Jagger's coming in on a horse. Who doesn't want to be part of that, right? That's
Right.
not, so whiskey seems really old and kind of fuddy-duddy compared to that, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, but around the world, everybody's like, no, thank you. So essentially what happens is that the blenders who make blended scotch, they were the only customers for single malt distilleries. So when the blenders are like, people are cutting back, our warehouses are full, the single malt distillers had two options: one, to shut down, which some of them did for
Mm.
just a little bit, some permanently, and then the other idea was to start selling, basically marketing single malt to consumers. So
Sure.
you're right. I mean, it is economic, but also necessity. So I kind of think about it as like,
Interesting.
the Beatles break up and suddenly Paul McCartney has his own, he puts out his own solo album. John Lennon puts out a solo album, and Ringo
Mm-hmm.
Starr, and together they're incredible as the Beatles. Like, you may or may not like Ringo Starr's album on its own,
I
but
don't.
with the others you love it, right? So that's
I'm not a
basically,
Ringo fan.
well, but that's
Yes.
the thing. But that's the same thing with
Right.
blended Scotch. Some of the single malts together, it's a beautiful harmony. But on
Mm.
its own, you're like, I don't really like what this is. But together, what it brings to the overall blend is incredible. So
Mm.
that's what I would encourage people to see: blends versus single malts. Is that single malt is essentially a soloist, a blend is a band or an orchestra, right? So and you're
Yeah, I
adding
mean, I
different
think,
proportions.
it's so funny. I think in my head, I always thought a blend was, I mean, it's not until you explained it out, and I know what a blend is. Like, there's
Right,
blended wines and all
right,
those
sure,
things. But in my head, I think I always thought that a blend was lesser
right.
instead
Well,
of thinking it as a concert and not
right.
necessarily lesser.
Well, that's the marketing because these brands, in order to sell single malt, they had to convince all of us that blends
It
were
was
like
better.
for dummies, and that sophisticated people drank single malts, and it
Mm,
worked. Like, it was very successful. The marketing, it just turns out not to be true, and blends are
hmm.
actually delicious in the bedrock of Scotch. So, I mean, I would say try both. Blends are also usually a much better value. They're
Hmm.
less expensive than single malts, so it's a great
Hmm.
alternative. And often, what I hear from consumers, what they want from single malts, that they want it to be smooth and drinkable and mixable. That's exactly a blend. So like,
Right.
people should be drinking things like Dewar's and Chivas Regal and Johnny Walker. I mean, they're great whiskeys. All right, that's easy because Scotch, is governed by the Scotch Whisky Association, so they have very specific rules. Ireland, on the other hand, there's a lot more freedom for distillers, but generally, I mean, up until fairly recently, there were only 3 distilleries in Ireland, right? There was Bushmills in the north, which makes single malt the way that they do in Scotland, but in Ireland, generally, they distill the whiskey 3 times. In Scotland, they generally do it twice.
Okay.
You have, in some places you have who do it twice, some, but generally that's the rule, right? With a few exceptions. And then in the south, like in at Middleton, which is down in Cork, which makes a lot of different brands like Jameson, they make what's called pot still whiskey. So again, they're using a copper pot still, but they're distilling it from malted and unmalted barley. So that's a little bit different. That was done because of tax reasons. At one point, the Crown was taxing distillers on how much malted barley. So they said, great, we'll use unmalted barley. So we'll cut our tax bill. So, and then now that's become obviously a hallmark of, Irish whiskey, the malted and unmalted barley. But then the same thing, a lot of Irish whiskey, what saved Irish whiskey essentially in the late 20th century was that they also started to make blends. So things like Jameson and others are, again, it's a blend of pot still or sometimes single malt plus grain whiskey, essentially made on a column still. So that, but now like in Ireland, there's been an explosion in like craft distilleries. So you're also seeing all types of different, like a rye whiskey, right? Which nobody ever made before, right?
Right. And so the rye whiskey, like you mentioned rye
Yeah.
earlier. So can we talk a little
Yeah.
bit about it? Because it's such a, it's such a buzz term right
Yes,
now,
for sure.
rye, and but you said that it's very complicated
Well,
to make rye
yeah, I mean, well, it's a little bit more, it's a little bit labor intensive, right? It's stickier and
because of the
there's,
seed.
yeah, it's like it makes a stickier mash and there are foaming issues. But like those who know how to make it, certainly there's no problem. And the folks who used to make it one day a year now make it one day a month, right? Which gives you a sense of like increased demand, but a lot of them are making bourbon 24/7, 365. So that gives you a sense of the demand for rye versus bourbon. But rye, again, was like our country's original whiskey. A lot of the regional whiskey cocktails were probably made with rye whiskey. And rye, in the modern era compared to bourbon, which is known for, bourbon has to be at least 51% corn, then a little
Right.
bit of malted barley, which helps with the fermentation process, and then the rest is usually rye, occasionally wheat for something like Maker's Mark. But bourbon has those sort of sweet vanilla notes that, from the corn, but also from the new oak barrel that it's aged in. Rye, on the other hand, is sort of the flip. It has to be at least 51% rye. And I think of rye and bourbon as almost like the difference between rye bread and cornbread, right? Rye is going to be a
Right.
little bit spicier, like a little bit more unctuous, right? It stands up really well in a cocktail. I'm talking about brands like Rittenhouse Rye or Wild Turkey or Old Overhaul, which is the oldest continuously produced whiskey in America, which has been around for hundreds of years.
Wow.
So rye is sort of truly our native spirit. Folks in Canada also use rye, but it's different, right? There are not many straight rye whiskeys from Canada, right?
Right.
Canadians have like incredible amount of freedom in terms of what they can make. So most of their whiskeys,
That sounds very, very Canada.
it
I have
does.
to
It
be
does. Right.
honest.
We're not gonna mess. We're not gonna interfere with how you make your whiskey. But like, basically, it has to be made in Canada, right? And essentially, you have like a corn whiskey as the base, and then they add other like types of whiskey to it to like flavoring whiskeys. So maybe it's one that's bourbon like or Scotch like or rye, right? Barley, right? And then they're blending it together. But again, it can be, they have a lot of freedom. Bourbon can only be made in the U.S. now. Like, thanks to an act of Congress in the 60s, you can't make bourbon in Canada or Mexico. You used to be able to before that, and the distillers did at different points in time. But now bourbon has to be in the U.S. I'm a Kentucky Colonel, which is an honorific title bestowed upon
I
people.
know. I had to read it like several times.
Yes,
I'm like, he's a
yes,
Kentucky colonel?
yes. I
What
mean,
does that
I tell my
mean?
family, you're free to call me Colonel Rothbaum.
Colonel.
Nobody ever does, even when I'm in Kentucky. I'm like, you should really be addressing me as Colonel, but
I
nobody
love
does.
it.
But basically, it's an honorific title bestowed upon folks who've made a contribution to the great state of Kentucky by the governor, right? So you get a beautiful proclamation signed by the governor, and the ability, I think, to get special license plates if I ever live in Kentucky. So not a lot.
Okay, wait. Okay, I want to get to Japanese
Yeah.
whiskey because it's so hot right
Oh, for
now.
sure.
And then we can get more
Yeah.
into the book and talk about
Yeah.
about a bunch of things. But so like here's one of the ones I have. I mean, I'm getting hit up by press releases about Japanese whiskey left, right, and
All the time.
sideways.
Yeah.
Just all the time. And I'm just sort of curious, was Japan always making whiskey? Like they seem sort of they're newer on the
Yeah.
scene because
I
of the
mean,
global economy, but were they
yeah.
as about whiskey as we were, or as Scotland
I
was?
mean, it's fairly new, right? Of all the the major whiskey producing regions or countries, Japan is like arguably the newest. So
Okay.
you're absolutely spot on. Japan, really, the industry starts in the 1920s when a company sends, basically decides that, okay, we're going to send somebody to Scotland to learn how to make whiskey. He comes back. The company he worked for folds. So the guy who starts Suntory hires him, and they create essentially the first Japanese whiskey, right? So that's in the 20s, like right after World War One ends. And then they produce a whiskey that's like the first Suntory whiskey, the first Yamazaki, which is too Scotch-like, so nobody really likes it. So the guy, the guy who went to Scotland leaves. He starts a company called Nika, right? So for a long time, essentially, you have two brands or two distilleries in Japan, Nika and Suntory, and they produce the lion's share of whiskey in Japan. Most of it, despite their best efforts to export it, most of it's really consumed in Japan, right? You could buy it. There was like a giant neon sign in Times Square for Nika for a while, or Suntory, and through the years they make different attempts to introduce it, and even last 15, 20 years I go to things like Whiskey Fest in New York. You can't even get close to like the Pappy Van Winkle table or the Johnny Walker table, and for a long time Suntory had a table and you could just walk right up, taste as much as you possibly wanted. They gave away, all types of awesome things, like a pen made out of a barrel. Nobody wanted it. It was a black pen, red pen, and a mechanical pen. So I was like, this is incredible. The whiskey's really
Right.
delicious. Why is nobody else at this table? What's going on, right? And then really about, now about let's say 15, not even 15 years ago, Suntory comes out with a product called Hibiki 12, which was incredibly delicious. Bartenders in New York, San Francisco, LA can't get enough of it, right? It
Right.
just blows everybody's mind, and that sort of blows open the doors. So you're right, it's not this obsession with Japanese whiskey. It's fairly new. Up until that point, you could really only find a handful of bottles. Like if you looked really, really hard, probably Suntory's Yamazaki, the 12 or 18. Nika was sometimes available. Now, not only is it Nika and Suntory and Fuji and Mars, but a
Oh my God,
lot
there's
of,
so many.
right, and a lot of folks who making traditional spirits like sochu in Japan is not that different from making whiskey. So a lot of those people who've been in the liquor industry sometimes for hundreds of years, they've never made whiskey, but they certainly could, and now they are. So we're getting all types of Japanese whiskey suddenly flooding the U.S., some that are fairly new, like literally a few years old. Some, who've tried to make whiskey decades ago and it didn't work out, are now making whiskey again. But there's a lot of freedom in Japan. And as it turns out, in my book, like a few years ago, there was sort of a scandal when it came out that some of the Japanese brands were blending into their Japanese whiskey from Canada or Scotland or other places.
Oh.
So, in reality, when I looked into it for the Whiskey Bible, Japanese pretty clear that they were doing this for decades. It's sort of on us that we didn't remember that or acknowledge that or understand it. So, that's been going on for a long, long time. And now,
but Noel, can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So, because whiskey has to sit in a barrel for a long time. Like, to get the product to market,
right,
it has to sit. So can we talk about that process a little bit?
Yeah,
because
sure.
It is a commitment.
Absolutely.
Unlike, gin or vodka, for example, which you can just make it and serve it.
Well, that's,
wine does have to sit longer, obviously. That is a commitment as well. So can we talk about that commitment and what the years mean? And we haven't even talked about the barrels and the char. There's it's such a
there's
rich
a lot.
topic. There's much here.
This is why the book is over 600 pages.
600 pages.
And also, I would point out to your listeners that you don't need to take notes because all this stuff is in the Whiskey Bible. It's like my job to memorize all this stuff. It's their job just to enjoy the whiskey, right? And if they want to double check this stuff, it's all in the Whiskey Bible, and each chapter has a section with the basics of what is and what is not bourbon or rye or Scotch. So again, it's all in there. I get it. People aren't going to remember all this. That's why the book exists. Just enjoy the whiskey, enjoy everything. But you're right. Sidney Frank, who started Grey Goose Vodka, his great quote was that he started it because you make vodka today and you sell it tomorrow, right? There's no barrel aging, right, in vodka.
Right.
So with whiskey, there's two problems. It has to be aged in a barrel, right? No matter where it's from. And depending upon how long can vary. But at least, you can, technically, it can be only for a few days in some places. But generally, we're talking 2 to 30 years, right? And part of it is that you're making whiskey for down the road. So all these brands are trying to forecast how much whiskey people will want, how much they can sell. Sometimes they overestimate, sometimes they underestimate, which is sometimes why we have surpluses or shortages. But the barrel, it's not like a glass container, right? It's not like a ball jar. The barrel, there's evaporation. So over time, which is what we call the angel share in our industry, you get evaporation. And depending upon where in the world you are, the angels are very, very thirsty, right? In America, we have very, very hot, humid summers. Some places in America, it's hot and humid all year round, right? Scotland, summer there, it's 60 degrees. This is why they don't drink whiskey on the rocks, because it's 60 degrees at the hottest, right? Who needs ice when it's that cold, right? So there, the whiskey as it ages loses proof. In America, proof climbs because the water is essentially evaporating in America. Alcohol is evaporating in Scotland. But the barrel provides basically all the color. Whiskey comes off the still perfectly clear like vodka or gin. It picks up all that beautiful color from the barrel. The barrel also, as the temperature fluctuates, which is what we need for aging, the pressure in the barrel changes, right? So as it gets hotter, the pressure in the barrel increases, right? There's a little bit of space between the liquid and the top of the head of the barrel. And there's pressure that pushes the alcohol into the staves, into the wood. Alcohol is a solvent, so it's breaking down the barrel. So then as it cools off, the alcohol comes back into the barrel, pulling with it all these flavor compounds from the barrel. Depending upon who you ask, up to 80% of the flavor in a whiskey comes from the barrel, right? And it's both, some of those things are water soluble, some of them are chemical soluble, those flavor compounds that are being pulled into the alcohol. And then over time, some of the flavor compounds that are actually inside the spirit that are produced while it's being fermented and then distilled those things evolve over time in the barrel, right? And they mature and kind of like evolve, and that's why whiskey is so rich and flavorful. So it's not just the barrel's just not a container; it's actually
Right.
integral to the reason why whiskey tastes like whiskey. And for a lot of people, that's hard to wrap their head around.
Well, I mean, to me, when I think about, on my other show, Foodie and the Beast, we have somebody coming in and pouring, it's a variety show. So
Yeah,
somebody's always pouring something throughout the show. And I love learning about I actually, lots of times we have different people on the show and somebody's like, oh, well, you're making wine. I'm making whiskey. I should get one of your barrels
yeah,
because I can you could see how those flavor profiles change
absolutely.
based on that. And I am hardly an expert on this at all, but I thought the char was so interesting, like what they do to that barrel to create whether it's the color or the sort of smokiness and texture in there.
Yeah, and it's not. It's charcoal is like a natural filter, right? So it's pulling
Hmm.
out like by in America and in a lot of parts of the world because we only use barrels once to make bourbon and rye, and then they're sent around the world, right? So
Mm.
Scotch producers, rum producers, tequila producers, basically any aged spirit basically buys used bourbon barrels, right, or American whiskey barrels, and then they're sent all over the world. So there's a little bit of
Hmm.
American whiskey in a lot of different products, if you think about it, because those barrels still have whiskey in the wood, right? But
Hmm.
in America, we char the inside of the barrel, right, and they do that in Scotland too. And that char layer really like is a filter, right? It filters out impurities. It also
Hmm.
helps. It sort of changes the chemistry of the wood, right? Sort of changing the wood sugars, right? Almost like consider like toasting a piece of bread, right? Where you have bread and it's not bad, and then you toast it and it's a lot better, right? It sort
Yep.
of almost bakes it and heats it up. So yeah, I mean, there's so many facets. I mean, we could literally have talked this whole time about
I know.
barrels and wood and the use of barrels and how people now will finish a whiskey, basically take it out of the original barrel and move it to a wine barrel or a barrel that held
Hmm.
port or sherry or red wine. And that has a completely different effect. And, you know, when I'm talking about these things, it's not subtle, right? Sometimes people are like, oh, I could never pick that up. Like, no, no, no. You absolutely could
You
pick
can.
that up.
Hmm.
I do think that, one thing that people often assume is that like all Scotch is smoky, right? And that's not, it's only a small number of Scotches that are smoky, and that
What's
comes
that one out of Scotland? Is it Lafroig?
Lefroy.
That
Yeah.
really,
Yeah. I mean,
yeah, Lafroig, yeah.
there's like an island off the west coast of Scotland called Isla, and there is the home of the smokiest, peatiest
Right?
maritime whiskeys, right? And it's caused because essentially during the ferment, like when we were talking about with the malted barley, when you're malting the barley, barley is kind
Hmm.
of like the Wolverine, the X-Men, of grain, right? Because it has
Hmm.
the enzymatic powers, which basically means it can turn starch to sugar by itself. It doesn't need any help, right? It just, as soon as the barley thinks that it's going to start growing, the seeds, they just convert their starches to sugar. It's incredible, like a transformer. But for whiskey, we traditionally would do that on the floor malting. We'd wet it. The barley would think that's about to grow. But we don't want the barley actually to grow because then it'll use all of its sugars. So we essentially roast it over a fire, right? And those fires traditionally have been peat fires. In Scotland, there aren't a lot of trees like America to burn, right?
Right.
So what do you burn? Well, peat is a sort of organic matter, sort of decomposing leaves and shrubs and all types of stuff. It, the flavor of the peat can kind of vary depending upon what's decomposing in it. But over time, essentially you can cut it out into logs, bricks, dry it, and then burn it. And that was like a
Mm.
fuel source for everything. But when you burn it, it's super smoky. And if you roast the barley over these smoke fires, you get really, really intense flavors. Sometimes people say it smells like Band-Aid or diaper or tires or peat or whatever it is. I mean, imagine like roasting a marshmallow over the most smoky fire,
Right.
right? You're going to get it in the marshmallow. Your hair's going to smell like it. Your
I was gonna say
clothing's going
it's
to
in my
smell
hair. I
right.
can smell it from here.
Right, you're going to be smelling it for days, right? And it's really fascinating. Is like if you eat the barley, the malted barley, which I've tried, it sort of tastes like a smoky grape nuts almost. That's where the smoke and the peat really come from for these super smoky whiskeys like Bowmore and Lefroy and Ardbeg, Kalila, Talisker, which is on nearby on Skye, which is a different island, also has that sort of flavor profile. So it's really fascinating. Again, like going back to blends, those really peaty, smoky malts sometimes add just a whisper of smoke or almost like a bass note to a blend, right? But some people love them drinking them on their own. I mean, that's the great thing about whiskey. Like, no matter what you like, there's usually a whiskey for you that somebody's producing somewhere around the world.
I mean, there's enough out there.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about two things because we will have to wrap up at some point. I'd love to talk about sort of, well, I'm going to talk about one thing first because I still have so many questions. So when it comes to cocktails, like you have 60 cocktails in the book, which is amazing. And there are some incredible cocktails made with whiskey. Is it like when you're looking at different whiskeys, is it like, yeah, this is a whiskey that should be drunk on its own. It's not cocktail whiskey, like I could see using a lesser sparkling if you wanted a mimosa, because why would you muddy a really good champagne
I
or a
mean,
really good sparkling? Is it the same thing with whiskey? What do you think?
I kind of feel like it takes more courage to make a cocktail with a very expensive or rare whiskey. But sometimes they make really, really good cocktails, right?
Okay.
So, that's sort of a personal preference. Like I've been at bars that are using like incredibly rare or expensive whiskeys for cocktails, and some of them are really delicious, right? And may actually even taste better than cheaper versions, right? It's sort of there are a lot of rules, right? People are very afraid to add anything to whiskey, like. They think maybe it's like Pop Rocks and cola and it's going to explode in your stomach or something, right?
But they talked about, I don't know, I did something years ago where they gave us little droppers to like let it bloom.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
You're right, because
help open it up.
when you add water to whiskey, there's a chemical reaction that happens that releases aromas and flavors. So in fact, it's good to add a little bit of water, right? But also it's your whiskey, right? Like, I don't know why this is the one area of the world.
There's no rules.
Like if you bought your steak from the butcher and they told you like before they gave it to you, like, promise me you're like not gonna put ketchup on this, like you'd be like, I'm gonna go to a different butcher. Like, why are you telling me like how I can cook my meat? It's the same thing. For some reason, I think most people are afraid, right, of being called out or asked questions. So like we hang on to these like supposed rules that most of them have like really no historical precedence. So like, if you want to drink your Macallan with Mountain Dew, like you should do that, right? Like if you enjoy it, you should.
You could be like, no judgment, little bit of judgment.
No,
judgment.
you know what? I think you should drink what makes you happy, right? In the manner that makes you happy, right? Why? It's like it's not my job to shame people, right? I don't care. Like as long as it brings you joy, because a lot of people drink stuff that they don't actually like because they know that they're not going to get any questions about it or nobody's going to ask them about it and they don't know what else to order.
I'm going to take that line from you. I think that is an incredible line, especially given everything going on these days. Like, it's not my job to shame you.
No.
You're 100% right. Like, just because you are like the authority, one of the like few authorities on this spirit, you're right. Everybody should enjoy it however they want.
I'm happy that people want to drink whiskey, right? And that they want to talk about it, right? And, is that the way that I'm going to drink whiskey? Maybe, maybe not. Like, I probably want to try it once, right? But, like, will I go back to that? No, but, like, you might also not like the way that I drink whiskey. So, whatever. But, like, we both can drink it our own way. So, to your point, I mean, some whiskeys are really delicate, right? Especially the older ones. Like we're talking 30, 40, 50 years old that some scotches can go to. Sometimes American whiskey gets there too. those don't need a lot, right? And if you add them to a cocktail, they can disappear, right? So you're not really going to taste it, and that's sort of the problem of using some of the more delicate older ones is that they'll be gone, right? And I mean they'll
Well,
be in
you're
there,
not
but you won't.
utilizing them,
Yeah,
right?
you just won't taste it. It's like,
It's sort of like an amateur move, right? Like you would hope
well,
that who's ever, like if
right,
some bar is using a really
that
expensive
they would showcase it
whiskey,
the right
that,
way. Yeah, you're right. I
right.
mean, and that's sort of, and some of that has to do with proof, right? You
Hmm.
know, usually the higher the proof, like the better that they work in cocktails because they can stand up to mixing and shaking
Mm.
and stirring and other ingredients, and that's why you sometimes want, like, you might not want to drink, a certain whiskey on its own, but like, say with vermouth and bitters, it makes a great
Hmm.
Manhattan.
Right.
So again, I mean, the beauty of whiskey is that there are very few like hard and fast rules, as it turns out, or like
Hmm.
hard and fast like laws for drinking it, right? And which means that, like, as a drinker, like, you should feel empowered to experiment and try
Hmm.
things, and everybody has a slightly different palate and the way that they sense aromas and flavors. So again, I mean, like, there are places that mix whiskey with tea, right? And I think that's
I've actually
amazing.
there's a boozy high tea here in
Yeah,
DC at the Pendry, and they mix whiskey with bergamot, and
right.
it's delicious.
Right. I mean, like, would I want to mix every whiskey with bergamot? Probably
No.
not. But like, some are probably amazing. It's kind of like gin. I mean, gin. They each have their own flavor profiles and have their own
Hmm.
botanicals, and they work with certain mixers. Other mixers they don't work with, but a different gin brand might. And I think people need to sort of start thinking of whiskey more like that. That each brand has their own flavor profile and house style, and like, you need to treat it that way. But with that said, things like ginger beer or ginger ale, kind of a no fail mix with whiskey, right?
Mm.
Whiskey, ice, good ginger beer, like, especially for a more muscular whiskey, higher proof,
Hmm.
90, 100 proof. That's a great cocktail, right? I mean, that's something
Hmm.
that people have been drinking forever. Whiskey and club soda, highball, that's a sensation in Japan. I mean, that's a great drink.
Right.
And depending upon your own preference and the whiskey, the ratio of how much water to whiskey that you're going to do in a glass can be varied. Like, you don't taste the whiskey, add a little bit more. You taste too much whiskey, add a little bit more ginger beer or club soda, right? And
Right.
it's like, Booker No, who's the grandson of Jim Beam, who created Booker's and sort of was one of the people who created this rebirth of American whiskey. He used to drink what he would call Kentucky iced tea every day, and it was
Mm.
bourbon, branch water, spring water, and ice. And depending upon the day he had, he'd vary the proportions. And I think that's very sensible, right? Some days you
Right.
might want a lighter drink. Some days you might want a little bit one that's a little bit more boozy or spirit forward. Like, totally fine.
Well, I do want to be clear. I've been drinking tea because my throat is sore throughout the entire show,
With
but
no
there is
whiskey. No
there's no
whiskey.
whiskey in this tea. But it can be medicinal.
Yeah.
So, it has it
And
does
and
like
it has
sort of
been
soothe the
treated by,
throat.
the first distillers were alchemists, right? And
Hmm.
for many, in many different eras, whiskey was treated by, a medicine, by the medical profession. Like, not so much these days; it's more recreational. But I think if
Yes,
something that brings you joy, then it's probably good for the soul, at least.
absolutely. All right, Noah. I mean, we barely cracked the book. And I have cracked it because I've really read through. I mean, obviously, I haven't read all
Yeah,
600 pages
yeah,
because there's so much in here. Tell everybody where we can find the book. Can we follow you on
yeah.
Insta? Give me the 411.
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram. I'm Noah_Rothbaum. Love to hear from folks, especially if you've follow-up questions or comment about the book. The book is available across the country, in online retailers and in the actual brick and mortar bookstores.
Yes, I'm sure Politics and Prose has it here in DC. But Noah, I just want to thank you so much for joining me and for really devoting so much of your life to the whiskey and to the creating this Bible. it really contains, your little head contains so much information and you were able to put it down in 600 pages. It's really amazing. So just a reminder, the book is called The Whiskey Bible. It's a complete guide to the world's greatest spirit. And you really want to get into it. It's just fascinating. And so is Noah. You can find it wherever you get your books. And I think it's going to look really great on my coffee table as well. So I'm Nikki Nellis. This is Industry Night. I've got more great conversations coming up, so stay tuned. My interview with Tom Sietsema, the former Washington Post food critic, has just dropped. Rock Harbor is joining me at Rimtang, and Eric Bruner Yang. I'm very excited. We're going to be at the City Ridge Development shortly. So until then, stir yourself up, maybe an old fashioned or a Manhattan. Of course, you want to follow me at NYCCINELLIS on all the platforms. Do follow me on Insta because you'll see my trip recently to Nashville. I did not drink whiskey, but I did drink. And actually, I drank with Holly Graham from Tokyo Confidential in Japan. She was mixing up amazing cocktails in Nashville for a pop-up. So you can see all that there. And, Insta, LinkedIn, etc. Subscribe on the pod, subscribe on YouTube. Do all those things, please. And everybody be safe out there and have a delicious week.
Produced by Heartcast Media.